I'm Jana.
And I'm Carol.
And this is the Real Talk Recreation Therapy Podcast.
On this podcast, we talk about real experiences and real research that back up the use of recreation therapy as a method of treatment for a variety of populations.
We try to keep it real as we address concerns and successes that we and other recreation therapists have had as we all navigate this awesome career field.
We don't have it all figured out, but one thing we know for sure is everything gets a lot easier when you can talk it out with a friend. So, therapeutic gardening, therapeutic horticulture, it can look like a lot of different things and in a lot of different places. So at its most basic, you might see a facility doing therapeutic planting activities or indoor gardening, such as the garden boxes used by veterans in a substance abuse treatment program, which was one of the articles that we had studied for this podcast. Or it could look like large-scale community gardens being used in a community setting. And so Jana and I are going to talk about some of our personal experience that we have using gardening as a modality in some of the different settings that we've worked in over the past few years. Yeah. So one of the settings that I have seen gardening used as a modality with clients was at a residential treatment facility. So I did my recreation therapy internship at a residential treatment facility for youth that was called Youth Villages Inner Harbor Campus down in Georgia. And they had this very large, beautiful community garden that was run by AmeriCorps volunteers, including a woman who actually had a degree in horticulture and whose goal was to pursue horticulture therapy. So as we're doing that podcast, I wonder if she has become a horticulture therapist yet. But anyways, so what they did is they provided age-appropriate garden activities for kids of all ages, because this residential treatment facility served kids ages 5 all the way up to 21. So they would have like younger kids doing very basic activities. They would build a little trellis and then they would plant beans in their classroom. And then once the bean sprouts grew, they got to take their beans out to the garden and then plant them and watch them grow. That was kind of more what the younger kids were doing. Whereas the older kids, they would have more unstructured garden time during the afternoons after school. They would go there and they'd get to like work on whatever garden project was needing to be done at the time. They got to go through the process of planting the garden, doing all the weeding and whatnot. And then at the end of the growing season, they were able to harvest it. And then they actually got to sell their produce to help them raise funds for different trips and stuff that they were going on. So kind of like an all-encompassing program that allowed kids of all ages to be involved up to a certain level. The other thing I loved about the program is that they had a lot of opportunities to do more with the produce. Like not only did they sell it in kind of like a mini farmer's market at the campus, but they were also able to use produce in things like cooking. They had an outdoor kitchen located right next to the garden, which just allowed for them to harvest like tomatoes and peppers, and then they made pizzas in these ovens. It was super cool. I feel like it was a great use of just like gardening that was really purposeful.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. So as the rec therapist, were you there every time they were doing that? Or was it kind of like you would come out and facilitate some things and then they would do it like on their own time? How did that work?
So in my experience, I was actually a rec therapy intern, so I was not the rec therapist. And the gardening program at this location was run by AmeriCorps volunteers. So it wasn't even really done by the recreational therapy program. However, I did get to do a few gardening sessions with my kids that I was doing my internship with using some of these garden tools.
Oh, that's really cool.
So I guess it wasn't really the recreation therapy happening, but I think had the recreation therapist wanted to be more involved in gardening as their activity, they could have used that space and it would have just looked like more facilitation of these gardening activities, probably with more checking in before the session, like how are you feeling? And then checking out after the session is kind of how they did a lot of their group programs there, to kind of talk through whatever emotions kids were having before they got to the program and then after they did the gardening.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I was just curious how that worked. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. And then my other experience with gardening was I worked for about a year in a memory care nursing home facility, and we had a small back patio garden that we kind of transformed into this really like relaxing space. And I think that kind of ties back into what we were talking about with just creating nice spaces for people, because that back patio was tiny. Like beyond the patio, beyond the fence, there was a tree. And then beyond that, it was just like apartments and houses and streets. Not the most aesthetically pleasing space, but we were able to fill that whole area with a bunch of raised garden beds that were actually garden tables. So you could pull your wheelchair right up to the garden. And then we planted all of these really good smelling herbs. So I would often take some of my residents out there for one-on-one sessions where I would do sensory activities like having them smell the different herbs. We had oregano, rosemary, mint. And I had one lady who she just loved, absolutely loved smelling the herbs. And she was kind of a theatrical person. Like I think that was her personality long before she had Alzheimer's. But so she would just be, oh, thank you so much. This is the most wonderful thing. Like, you are the best person ever for bringing me this oregano to smell. It was the cutest thing. She loved it. It made her happy. And that was always a win working with the dementia population. We also use the garden for group activities. I would take my residents out there in the mornings to either do morning exercise or even just sit outside, because when they're inside, you don't really get a lot of natural light. And so it kind of offsets your circadian rhythm, which for people with dementia can get really messed up sometimes, which contributes to some of their behaviors, some of their agitation. So like being able to have that morning sun to kind of help them be more awake during the day is just a really easy thing to do that I found helpful and therapeutic for my residents.
I thought that was really cool that you brought that up, because that is like a common symptom, right, of dementia is just being like disoriented that way. And what a great easy way to orient someone. Just take them outside. Look, it's morning.
Yeah. And it wasn't the most active garden programs because a lot of my residents like no longer had motor skills or cognitive skills to be able to do. Like I had a few residents that would be able to do planting and watering and whatnot, but majority of them just kind of came out and got to like enjoy the space, kind of be out in nature. But you can sort of see them relax. Like even I had quite a few nonverbal, like late stage dementia patients who were not able to speak, but you would kind of watch their body like posture just kind of relax. They might like fall asleep, or you'd like see them just their eyes like tracking around to the trees, and then like you can just kind of, I mean, it's not the most quantitative research to say that being outdoors like helped them, but you could see them having some sort of benefit in how their attitude, not even their attitude, how their like posture changed.
Yeah, like their whole affect maybe. And you know, like even if there wasn't like quantitative evidence, there is in the research that is kind of backing up exactly what you're saying. Like there's so much about dementia and gardening, and it is those kind of less active activities, like just being out there. And I think that's so cool that you guys did an herb. Like what a great idea to do an herb garden, because that gets their senses going, maybe memories. Oh, I love mint, that kind of thing. Like that's such a
the old guys would sit out and like reminisce about sitting out shooting the breeze. It was really cute.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Yeah, someone should definitely take Carol's idea and go with it.
I'm sure people have done this before. I'm sure many of you listening to this podcast have done gardening with your clients, but anyways.
Yeah, no, it's great. So I get to talk about our garden at Schofield. So and Schofield, everyone, is the base that we worked at when we worked with soldiers in recovery. So if I say Schofield and not soldiers in recovery, that we're talking about soldiers here, and they're recovering from injuries and illnesses. So the whole range of stuff, kind of like what we were saying in our first episode. But anyway, the Schofield gardening was kind of an allotment gardening community space. So the manager of the garden had a bunch of little plots that people could pay like $2 a month for this plot. And so everyone kind of like anyone that worked there, you could apply to get a garden space, but it wasn't community in the sense that we're all sharing like the fruits and vegetables that we make from it. Like it's yours unless it's hanging over the fence, because in Hawaii there's a thing that if the food is hanging over the fence, then it's free game. So
maybe or our soldiers just said that because they like to take fruit hanging over, but anyways.
I mean, that was the thing at my house too. We'd have neighbors come and steal our mangoes all the time. We were like, no, we wanted our mangoes.
Well, cultural differences, I guess.
Yeah, it's a thing. So anyway, when the program first began, I would say it was probably more structured and staff led. So we got this plot and it was pretty overgrown. And so was really led by the staff, by the recreation therapists to just say, okay, yeah, today we're going to, carve out this area. We're going to try and get rid of these weeds, that kind of thing. And then as we went on, it got less staff structured, kind of following this leisure ability model, right, guys? Like we start with like the therapist telling you like this is how it works, this is what you do, and then as you get more control and more competent and feel safer and better in the garden, I guess, it really transitioned to being very soldier led. And it actually kind of the pandemic was really a catalyst for that, because when the pandemic when we all had to shut down, there were 2 soldiers that were living in the barracks, and they had been coming to gardening a little bit before, and they weren't allowed to go anywhere except for base, and they wanted to get out of the barracks, so they asked us if they could go and work in the garden. And so they started working in the garden, and they really kind of made it their own thing. They really took control of it. And then when we came back after the lockdown, it had really transitioned from us like leading or suggesting things to it being a very community, like everyone kind of talking together. Oh, I'm going to bring these flowers. I'm going to bring this food. Like, let's plant this. Let's do this. And really, especially led by these 2 soldiers. So it's kind of magical, I would say. Yeah. It's pretty cool.
What I loved about the garden too was that, like, we kind of talked about it earlier with how people would come there expecting it to be an activity where they didn't have to socialize with people. But then it quickly became like the people that came to gardening always came to gardening, and they would become friends with the other people at gardening because they all just enjoyed having that relaxing time in a very aesthetically pleasing atmosphere to kind of just hang out and like talk about not only gardening, but also what they were going through in their treatment. So I just thought that it was a really cool space to kind of facilitate those conversations, because it was a lot more relaxed than like their barracks building. It was a lot more relaxed than any of the medical appointments that they had to go in, or their very like strict military meetings that kind of follow different protocols. It was just this natural space where people came and like didn't have to wear their uniforms and got to like get their hands dirty.
Yeah, it was really like going back to that study that you said, like it really brought in those elements that she was talking about, like getting them away from the stressful areas, like having by the end, it was very aesthetically pleasing to be there.
Yeah.
And
so beautiful at one point.
Yeah. So it's really good. We had visions of where it could go. Like when we first started the gardening program, we thought maybe we'll sell the produce. It was mostly like growing food. There were some like herbs and flowers, but mostly growing food. So in the beginning, we had like thought maybe we'll like sell it, and then that can pay for gardening funds and things like that. While we were there, it never got to that point. We said before, we'd give it to people and let them take it home. But that's definitely something that you could do if you kind of wanted to bring it next level. We would have like potlucks sometimes, like gardening harvests and things like that, and that was really great.
So on the other end of gardening, we talked a lot about more larger scale gardens, like big outdoor community gardens, or even just like a back patio garden. But I've actually done gardening projects that happened on a much smaller scale. For a little bit, I was working in Texas doing in-home recreation therapy with kids. And so there was a few clients that I would do these different gardening interventions with, where I would have them with me to a nursery, like a Home Depot or a Lowe's, and we would get to go through the process of picking out which plants we wanted to plant, which could be as involved or as like uninvolved as you want to be. For some of the clients, I had them do research on like, okay, are we getting an annual or a perennial? Is the plant like, does it need to be in direct sunlight? Is it good in shade? You can kind of like get more into the science really behind planting. Or I would have them work on like social community skills, money management. Okay, like this plant costs $5. Do we have that much money? Like, how do we pay for it? How do we make change? All those kind of community integration things that go with rec therapy that we do a lot. And then I would have the clients take the plant home and we would go through the process of planting it. They might have like a small window garden or even just potting it into a new pot. I might have them like paint the pot. And through that process, we were able to kind of talk about different things like how you can use gardening for stress relief. Like, oh, like let's talk about how we felt while we were doing this activity. Did we feel relaxing? Does being in an outdoor garden space make us feel relaxed? And how can we kind of create that space at home with the plants that we have there? I also talked about things like being responsible for our plant. Like a lot of the kids that I worked with definitely struggled in school with like getting their homework done. And so things like that, like if you're able to be responsible caring for a plant, that can kind of generalize over to taking responsibility in other areas, whether it's for getting your homework done or for managing your emotions a little bit better, all sorts of things. And then the nice thing with that too is that I was able to have their parents reinforce that idea of like taking care of the plant because their parents were able to remind them, oh, like you got to make sure you water your plant. And it's cool because with the in-home planting activities, you're able to kind of see, hopefully, how the plant grows, and you can reflect on that and process like that progress. I know I talked about with one girl how when we first met, we did a garden activity and like the plant was really little. And then when I finished working with her, the plant had grown a lot. So I was able to kind of like process that as like, well, just like the plant grew, you also grew, and like talk about all the ways that she grew. I really like gardening, even at that really simple scale where you can take just a few plants in a pot and have clients plant them and put them in spaces and just kind of make it their own, feel proud of that plant, have something to care for. Like there's a lot of therapeutic benefits to that very basic gardening activity.
And it's so great if you don't have like that space available, you know, if you don't have a green space or a space
Yeah.
that someone's willing to let you make green in your area, like there are real benefits. And again, the research had this too of just having like the potted plants in your house. So it's a nice, I know it's a little difficult with the gardening research that there's so many different, like the scope is so big, but it's also really nice to be able to say like this can count, this can count, this can count, because as recreation therapists, we really need to be able to adapt to
Yeah.
those different settings, different needs. So another thing, if you don't have that green space, is going to a community garden or going to visit a garden. So these garden walks or garden visits, that was another thing that we did in Hawaii with soldiers, and now I'm doing in Singapore with military families visiting gardens. So when you are researching the gardens, know that and this can be, you know, botanical gardens or community gardens or kind of just seeing the gardens or the green spaces in your area. Some of the activities are put on by the gardens. And I think that's actually how we first started going to these garden spaces. They were doing a lei making activity. And so we went to a garden, like a public garden that was very near where we worked. So it was off site, but it was very close. So it was like maybe 10 minutes away. And that's kind of how we first started getting into it. And then like we'd call them and ask them kind of what they had. They had one, there was this big pond where you could go bamboo fishing. You'd have to put the fishes back, which our soldiers didn't like, but like you could kind of, you know, do that. And bird watching or like scavenger hunts is a big one in botanical gardens. Like, hey, go see if you can find these birds or these plants. We acknowledge that Hawaii is different than a lot of areas of the world, so it may not like
so
you know
beautiful.
I just like when I was like looking around for when I was doing an assessment of the gardens that I'm taking the families to in Singapore, the variety of the animals and the birds is so fun in these tropical places, but they're really awesome in other places too. You just kind of have to find what, you know, what fits. It's very, I guess it's kind of a cultural thing, right? Like the botanical garden in your area. So there's like those activities. And then we would do our own activities too. Like we would go on just walking through the garden, right? Just exploring the garden. We did a painting in the garden, which is really fun. And I've seen people do that here. So that's probably another thing that I'll assess whether we can do that here as well. And then we did yoga at a botanical garden. So, you know, you can take like maybe activities that you do in a regular space and just do it at the garden. Kind of add that extra level.
And I think that provides a lot of opportunities to work on all sorts of community integration things. Like for some of our soldiers that we worked with that had PTSD, they weren't necessarily super comfortable going out into a lot of community spaces, but the garden typically was not as crowded. It wasn't like you were in a tight, closed indoor space that might kind of like trigger some of their PTSD symptoms. Being able to take people out to a garden is could be a nice way to ease into going to more community settings. With other populations too, you might be able to work on various like social skills, whether it's talking to people or transportation or just finding resources that exist in their community that have activities. Like for example, all those free gardening activities that we were able to take our soldiers on, they totally could have called that garden and went out and did those things too. And I think some of them did go on to attend future community activities at some of the gardens.
Yeah, it's a really great thing about those community gardens, about any community program, right? Is if you can get them into it, if you can get them to buy into it, if you can get them to see like, yes, this is wheelchair accessible. Yes, this is like an accessible place for you, then it becomes a sanctuary that they can go back to. So, okay, so we're gonna transition and talk about best practices and kind of the APIE process and gardening. So first with assessment. So during this phase of therapeutic horticulture, not horticulture therapy, they're different. We can do therapeutic
gardening as therapy, therapeutic use of the garden. Yeah, whatever you want to call it. As you're a recreational therapist, you're using gardening for your sessions.
So there's a couple of things, right? When you're assessing, you want to assess who are the participants you're going to be working with, what is their experience, ability, interest level in gardening activities you're going to be doing with them, what gardening spaces and tools are available to you, what safety measures should be in place for gardening, and what kind of activities are you going to do? Is it a garden walking or non-traditional? If so, then how structured does it need to be? Don't let people eat the dirt. This will be an ongoing thing this will just be a theme of the podcast is don't let people eat X.
Yeah, for real. We're going to talk about it when we talk about art. We talked about it in our games podcast. Just gotta watch out for people eating things that they shouldn't be eating.
Yeah, which can be tricky in the garden because sometimes you can eat them. But
that's true.
But yeah, like just, assessing like, do they need to be with you? Do you need to have other staff members there? Is it okay? Are they at a level where it's okay for them to walk away from you and meditate or paint? Or does it need to be like more facilitated, that kind of thing? And then as far as like assessing the individual, we'll include a list of formal assessments in our show notes. There were tons of different ones used. Most of them were it just depends on what your goals are, right? So when you're assessing someone and trying to figure out what their goals are, if you're trying to increase engagement, there's engagement scales, quality of life, there's a quality of life scales, there's social scales. There's pretty much an assessment for everything. You just got to find it. So we'll link to those in the show notes. It's something that you've been looking for.
Which is awesome because it means that gardening can really be a useful modality for a lot of different goals with a lot of different populations.
Yeah, definitely.
So you get through your assessment phase. You know who your clients are, you know what their goals are for the gardening session, and you know what resources are available for you. So now it's time to kind of work on that planning phase, figure out what you're going to do to execute it. So if you're going to do gardening on site, it's important to make sure that you, like Jana said, have all the resources that you need. You may have to do research on the plants or gardening techniques because unlike horticulture therapists, a lot of us rec therapists don't necessarily have a lot of formal education in gardening. So some places that might be helpful besides the internet, besides YouTube, places that you could talk to, it would be even just go to like a nursery in your area because a lot of people working at nurseries are able to make good recommendations for plants that are going to be able to be grown in all sorts of settings. Like, is the soil wet? Is the soil dry? Is there a lot of shade there? Is it direct sunlight? What type of plants do you want to grow during that time of year? Like, what plants will be most appropriate to grow for the population that you're working with. So like if you're working with kids or a population that might not have a lot of patience and like might feel like their plant has died, like it's nice to have something that's going to grow quickly enough that they'll be able to kind of see their hard work come into fruition, literally see their work in fruition.
I was gonna say, like, pineapples seem like a great thing to grow in Hawaii, right? Well, it takes 3 years to grow them, guys. So you're not
They
gonna
are a great thing to grow, but you have to you gotta stick with it.
Yeah, you don't get to eat that pineapple, and it's so small when you don't have all the extra stuff to give it that it's definitely a labor of pass it on, not a labor of great, I'll eat this pineapple next week. Yeah, no.
Yeah, definitely. And then once you figure out what plants you're growing, you also want to make sure that you have all the proper tools, and then consider what challenges may exist to successfully completing your garden activity. So for example, during my internship at Youth Villages, I actually made a whole 12-week gardening program for this unit of 5 to 8-year-olds that I was working with for my internship. And it was great. I had them start plants from seedlings. We went through this whole process, and the end goal of the program was to have them build their own little raised garden bed that they would paint, and it would be like their unit's garden that they could be proud of. And they did it. It was awesome. They built the whole raised bed. We filled it with dirt. We put the plants in it. And then after the garden was successfully built, I came back a few days later, and all the plants were dead and had been fried because the location that I put the garden was in direct sunlight. And to top it off, it was nowhere near any hoses. So I kind of had a sinking feeling, and I haven't ever reached out to my supervisor to ask her about it, but I have a feeling that the garden probably just died, and future units probably didn't use it, and it's probably just sitting there, because hauling water can be really just a hassle and a pain, especially when you're a busy rec therapist who's running a bunch of other programs. So it's important to plan out where you're going to put your garden, and consider those really specific things will there be enough water? Will there be enough sunlight? Just those little things that maybe don't pertain so much to rec therapy, but are very specific to the activity and allowing your activity to be successful. And in another setting, this might look like making sure that where you store your plants when you're not using them, if you're doing tabletop planting activities, making sure that they're well cared for so you don't have a bunch of dead plants when you need them to be alive, or you have the tools in the right place. All those things are important to consider, especially when you're doing on-site gardening.
Man, that is just tragic. You were describing this beautiful thing, and I was like, this is gonna
be so cute. And then all the plants were dead the next day because it was Georgia and super hot. So say la vie, if I make a garden again, I always think about where's the water.
Oh, well, see, that's great. At least the lesson is learned. And
I learned. Sorry, Youth Villages. Wasting your money in a garden that was maybe not well placed.
It was about the journey.
That's true. It was about the process, and the kids that were a part of that process got something out of it. But I don't know about future generations.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's fair. If you're taking them off-site, garden walk, local botanical garden, that kind of thing, you want to consider transportation, accessible features you'll need for your clients. Call the garden and find out, can a wheelchair, are there paths available for the wheelchair? How far are the bathrooms? If there's admission fees, how close can you park? All of these things, because some of the gardens, right, can be lots of acres. And so knowing, okay, if we're going to go out into this, how do we come back? That kind of thing, making sure you kind of have your route planned. That was why I needed to go out and assess these gardens in Singapore, right? Because I had never been, and I was glad I did, because the map that was available online is this tourist map, right? With pictures and stuff, but not necessarily tons of details. And so it was good to be able to map it out for the people I'm working with now. It needs to be stroller accessible, that kind of thing. So making sure that we were on paths that weren't going to end, just, those general things that you're probably all thinking about, but I have personally experienced is a need to make sure you check. As far as the admissions, there's lots of some communities will have reduced rates for people. So if you're worried about the price, then you can ask them hey, we're this group and this is what we're about, and can you give us a reduced rate so that we can all come in? Or Some of them, it will be donation based, or if you listen to this like educational talk, then you can get in for less money, that kind of thing. So just kind of find what your options are. So yeah, we went to this beautiful garden in Hawaii called Ho'omaluhia. And I definitely could have been better about having like a hard time for meeting up and a hard place for meeting up, because there were a couple of parking lots and one had a visitor center and the other didn't. And so people were a little confused. And with our clients, everyone has such a wide range of different things, right? Some people, it was like they needed to take a lot more breaks, and some like they could go off and be fine. And so making sure to know like where are the benches, where are that kind of thing, like just kind of being aware of who is coming and what their needs will be is, you assess that, but also when you're planning, you like map out like, okay, break here, stop here. This is where we'll do the yoga because it's away from people, all those kind of things. Is there anything else that I'm missing on that?
Well, I think we talked a lot about like all those little things you need to plan for actually like doing your activity, or like making sure that your participants are able to make it to doing the activity. So I think it's also important to just like have like a layout planned for how you're going to facilitate whatever you're facilitating. I think the group that we were talking about with the botanical garden, it was a lot less facilitation on our part because we were leading them around doing things, but like Jana led a yoga group, so she had to have like a plan set out for what she was going to accomplish during her yoga group. Or like if you're working on specific goals with the clients, obviously being able to say like, okay, this is where we're going to stop and work on this skill, or like this is where we're going to do this activity, just kind of having that all laid out beforehand, so you're not going to wing it.
Yeah, that's perfect. So once you're there, the implementation phase. So each stage of gardening kind of requires different adaptations, right? So back to the gardening that we had on site with the soldiers in recovery. When we first got it, there was a lot of clearing that needed to happen. And so we were like using the hoe, we were a lot more big tools. And so during that stage, when the gardening program had just started and we were just barely like clearing people to be able to participate, we had to be quite careful to make sure that no one got too excited and spent too much time on the equipment, because maybe they don't feel like it's a lot, but it would be like an hour later, that kind of thing, or they want to help because they just really want the garden to look good soon. And so they're like, yeah, like making sure that the goals that we had for the day, because we were only there for an hour a day, right?
Yeah.
And just making sure that the goals we had were realistic. So we'd like make people take turns, we'd be helping, for some of them, we would try and find ways for them to just kind of hang out while we're doing that part, right? So I guess that is probably something to really pay attention to, specifically with gardening, because it's going to change, right? As once it's cleared, then you're planting. Okay, who can plant? How do we need to adapt the planting phase? And you're weeding. What are some tools we can use for weeding? So I think that's probably maybe a kind of unique thing about gardening, is that each stage of your implementation is going to maybe look a little different. We already kind of talked about like the growth patterns, like don't get a pineapple, right? if you want to be able to harvest it, well, for us, like the clients would leave in like 6 months to a year usually. So the person that planted the pineapple wasn't going to likely be harvesting the pineapple, but there were a lot of crops that we could plant and they would be ready in a couple of weeks. And so for our program, it worked really well that way, because we wanted to be able to kind of cycle through the growth of the plant quickly. And so you plant it, you weed it, take care of it, harvest it, do it again. And so there was like ongoing activities that way for people to do, especially if they were new to the garden and were unsure. It was like an easier thing to be like, oh, this thing right here is at this stage, you can do this kind of thing. If you're doing garden walking or other non-traditional activities, I guess a big thing with like the yoga was people were a little nervous to is it okay like that I'm doing yoga right here? Like, are people gonna walk by me? That kind of thing. So trying to be aware of, people's sensibilities and take them away so that someone's not like jumping in on your yoga session thinking it's a public thing or like watching all of you do your meditation. If you're painting, like make sure it's okay with the garden, right? To have those tools and where is it okay, and keeping them, kind of all those things, and then assessing as you're going. Gardening
Yeah.
could maybe add in other elements, right? Like bugs, rain, things like that. So, adapting as you go.
Yeah,
Um,
I think gardening, it does become kind of like a challenging modality for rec therapists, just in the sense that you really, if you do long-term gardening, you really kind of become an expert at whatever you're gardening, because you have to know about how to plant things and like the seasonal changes and even just the upkeep of the garden. Like you don't always, sometimes you can plan into your sessions and allow your kids to, but I've also worked like, for example, at the nursing home where my residents weren't really taking care of the garden. So I had to like add it into my day and my activity assistance day to like make sure that we did all those garden care tasks so that the garden would stay nice so that when we did implement it. So I love gardening as a modality, but I also think that when you use it, you like learn a lot. It's more involved sometimes.
yeah, definitely. But I can definitely see how horticulture came to be, right? Horticulture therapy. They were like,
Mm-hmm.
let's just give you a boost. You can know all about horticulture and you can specifically work on that, because I think, yes, a therapist could totally like specifically have a whole program about gardening, and it could be very therapeutic and very helpful for clients, and it would be great. So anything else with implementation?
Well, if we also could go back to the topic of M-placed flow that we had talked about, which is kind of just the idea that the way that we present the garden and also how we like involve our participants in gardening activity can really impact what they get out of it. So for implementation, I would just say a good suggestion is to, when participants are able to be autonomous, to like let them, maybe starting out with your gardening and the beginning sessions, the participants might not know what they're doing or they might need more instruction, but like as they become more experienced, as they learn more, kind of giving them space to like decide what they want to do, or like, oh, can they like decide what they want to plant? Like at the residential treatment facility, the older kids that were working in the garden, they got to pick what was being planted, and so they had a lot of ownership in what they were harvesting, because they were like, oh yeah, I chose that, I planted it, I like tended it. And I think that's a big part of like just realizing when we need to be more hands off and kind of let the participant take the reins as far as the gardening goes, and also when to not. Like that's a good thing to remember.
Yeah, I love that you said that, because again, it goes back to a lot of the research, that those were conclusions that they came to as well. Like if
Mhm.
maybe again, like you said, like maybe not for decreased mental status, right? Like
Yeah.
make sure that you don't leave someone who's disoriented in the garden to figure out how to do things.
No,
But
no, no.
as you teach them these things, the goal is that they are becoming their own expert in the thing that they're doing. And that is where we found a lot of the benefits of gardening come through.
Yeah, absolutely. You just think about all that growth that's going through, and then to like be at the end, be like, wow, look what I did. So after you implement your garden activity session, whatever that is, you want to evaluate it. So some things to look at are just what equipment was useful, what equipment wasn't useful, how can we do things better. I think as rec therapists, we're always adapting things. So just at the end of a program, asking like what adaptations worked, what adaptations are we missing. And with gardening, it's really easy to see where you failed because your plants may have not grown, or like some new bug may have come in and like eat them all, or there was a disease. So there's a lot of things to be evaluated, and like learning different fertilizers or pesticides, or like what you need to do to make your garden successful. It's also important to be able to ask participants like what they liked about it. This kind of goes along with that whole idea of giving people autonomy. If they're able to make those comments about the garden, like what do they like about it, what do you think we should plant next time, like how do you think we should do this layout. That's just more opportunities for you to learn about how effective a gardening program was, and to also give your participants that chance to kind of make their own decisions and
Yeah.
grow in their, I don't know, self-confidence and all that good therapeutic stuff.
Yeah, no, definitely. And this is like most of the studies that we read, they did pre and post assessment, right? Because they're studying things like well-being or engagement. They're trying to see the change. So obviously, maybe the obvious thing is that you'd also redo those assessments, right? Like if you were
Yes.
assessing someone's quality of life at the beginning, go ahead and have them fill it out again and go over the results with them and see if this was working towards their goals.
And then also, rec therapists, we want to document our progress. So whatever type of documentation that you use at your facility will probably work for gardening, whether it's a narrative note or like a soap note or whatever. There's also some things that you can do to have your clients, depending on what their cognitive levels are, to kind of like reflect on their experiences. So one thing that I think, Jana, you did when you were doing wilderness therapy was a journal, right?
Yeah, yeah. Everyone would have like a journal, and this was something that I thought was really cool. That a lot of the gardening programs in the research that we read had, they'd have like a gardening journal, especially if it was like a we went to the garden yesterday and weeded, we went to the garden the day before and weeded, and now there are no weeds, and what are we gonna do? And kind of like just kind of reflecting on like the progress of the plants or drawing them out or things like that. It's a great way to get some qualitative evidence maybe of
Yeah.
how things are going for the clients. You can kind of see if you just have them like kind of write what you thought of today and they're like, this is the worst, it was so hot and gardening makes me angry and or the bugs ate everything and I'm depressed. I don't know. No one is ever as clear as that, but
With some
you know.
clients. But yeah, for sure. I think that that's very realistic for some of the people that we worked with. They just, at least initially, don't enjoy the gardening, which is fine.
Yeah, that's where you like try and get that in place flow, right? And try and like what could I do to make this better for you, better experience for you.
Yeah, and I just love that the journal lets you like track over time. So like you might not see all that positive affect at the beginning, but maybe for some people that really connect with the gardening activity, you might be able to see in their journal like them growing more excited about what they're growing or
Yeah.
stuff like that.
And honestly, journaling can be a whole modality that we could talk about too. So yeah, it's a therapy and it's a document, right? A way to say what have we observed.
We've talked about the APIE process. I know we kind of talked about this already with some of our assessment, but a big thing to make sure that with all activities is to just make sure that all of our garden activities are going to be safe for our clients. With assessment, we want to know what are the challenges facing our clients, what are maybe some potential safety risks that are specific to our clients, and make plans for that. For example, we talked about people eating dirt, making sure that if a resident might start to eat something that they shouldn't, we're going to watch out for that. Or if we're working in a setting where our clients might be prone to self-harm, that we're not putting them in the reach of any tools that might be harmful for them. And like most of the facilities that rec therapists work with have policies and procedures in place for this, but just being aware of what those risks might be when you're out in the garden is something that's important to do. And then beyond those really specific risk management things that pertain to your individual clients, there's also a lot of really general safety things that you can consider when working in the garden. Things like making sure that people are wearing the proper clothing. So like, for example, at our garden out in Hawaii, it was really buggy, it'd be really sunny, it could be like rainy. And we were using a lot of like sharp tools like rakes and hoes and shovels and whatnot. So making sure people had closed-toed shoes on, that they had bug spray. If it's going to be really sunny out, making sure they're wearing sunscreen, monitoring your participants for any sign of heat fatigue, making sure they're getting enough water, and then also just keeping track of the weather. Whenever you're doing anything outdoors, you want to be aware like, oh, is there a storm coming? Like maybe we need to cancel for today, or like what is the plan in place for if you have any sort of inclement weather.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe also specifically with being outside, being in the garden, like checking on allergies, checking on what is
Like
it
bee
called? Like,
stings even.
yeah, bee stings. What it
If you need like an EpiPen or something.
Right. And some people like during the spring they have more like their allergies act up
Oh, like
more.
seasonal allergies.
Yes, thank you. I was trying to remember what
Yeah.
it was. But yeah, things like that you'll probably know in any way working with clients,
Mhm.
but it depends kind of on what your setting is, right? And so making sure that that's not something you skip in your assessment is finding out those things. And if this is new or if you haven't had this, like making sure you're talking to the other members of the treatment team about yeah, like with the self-harm stuff, right? Like who should be allowed to be out when we're using the gardening tools, who should be like,
Yeah.
how should we adapt this?
Yeah, self-harm or even just like cognitive level, like that's true of a lot of different populations, like working with kids, like what kids are going to be able to pay attention or what kid might like wander off and like get into trouble, like
Mhm.
that sort of thing. Just know who your participants are so you can make the most safest plan for them.
Yeah.
Most safe, very professional. Yes.
Having the first aid kit, right? Because little cuts, little bites, things like that can definitely be a thing.
And then another thing too with safety, it really depends on like what your setting is that you're working in. But for example, like at a community garden or our garden that was on the military base, it was kind of like off the beaten path. Like we weren't really around a lot of people. It was kind of out of the way of things. So there was always like talk of like what would happen if we were to have some sort of medical emergency out at the garden. And that was never an issue for us, but just like thinking through, okay, what are some of the risks with this population? Like, do we have enough staff out here that if something were to happen, that we are able to handle the situation? Or like, is there a phone number we would need to call if something were to happen? Like, how would we get help out here? And things like that are also important to consider when you're taking people out to community gardens or botanical gardens. Obviously, like, you would hopefully know your participants like medical history and any sort of risk that they would have, but maybe just considering like what emergency procedures do we need to have in place? Like, do we have enough staff to keep all of our participants not only engaged, but also safe? And again, that's really population specific and client specific too for like what you'll need. But just important things to think about because we want to just go out there and do the activity and get in the garden, but we also need to keep our clients safe and have plans in place for if unsafe things happen.
Yeah, that's perfect. I love that you said all of that. That's really good things to know. Like what is our emergency plan and working with everyone to make sure that they're aware of the plan. And maybe even if you're going off site, like talking to the people, like, okay, like if we needed transport. I know when we did one of the activities we did, we were going quite far off the beaten path. And so we got special permission to drive there, like drive through the garden. And so like that, just so that the participants wouldn't have to walk so far, and also so that we
Yeah.
could have a car out there in case something did happen, we could get them out quickly. And so yeah,
Yeah.
definitely important things to have there.
Obviously, with a lot of activities that we do as recreational therapists, there are many, many adaptations that you can do when you're using gardening as a modality. So, the first adaptation is kind of more just keeping your participants in mind when you're designing a garden. So, this really only applies if you're the one who's building a garden, maybe your facility is just getting garden spaces or you're trying to implement a new garden program. But things to consider would be is if you're working with clients that are in wheelchairs, is the space between garden beds wide enough to fit people in wheelchairs? Is the ground between garden spaces, whether it's like a garden path or just like space between garden beds, is that surface something that a wheelchair is able to roll over? And maybe this isn't a consideration for the population that you're working with, but if it is, I think design elements can have a big part to play in how accessible and how adaptive an activity can be. I mean, we could really do a whole podcast episode on like accessible design. So I won't get too much more into it than that, but just considering what accessible features will be able to let your clients participate in the activity are super great. One of the things that I thought was really cool at the nursing home that I worked with was that we had these rolling garden tables so that you could easily put either a chair or a wheelchair right up to the garden and you tuck your legs right under it. So it'd be just like a desk, but the garden on top. And so we were able to push the residents right up to it, and then they were able to reach and do the gardening on the table. And then when they were done, we were able to take them away. And so that was a really cool adaptation. And a lot of rehabilitation facilities will have this too, just to allow people that are in wheelchairs or people that can't like necessarily kneel down on the ground are able to still garden. Even like having the garden beds being higher up, or like hanging planters that people can reach up in the air and garden with, is an adaptable feature that would allow people to do more gardening than if it was just on the ground. Let's see. In addition to that, there's all sorts of adaptive tools. I did a really brief Google search because I know that there's a lot of adaptive tools out there, but I myself haven't really worked with a lot of them specifically. And I'll put the link in the show notes to the website I found, but there were 10 different adaptive tools that I thought were really cool. There was a bunch of ergonomic handles on different gardening tools, which you might think like that's really useful for somebody that isn't able to grasp something. That could be somebody who has a limb difference. It could even just be an older adult whose like motor skills are not as strong as they used to be. There were long reach garden tools, so like garden hose that were just like really long, or rakes that were really long. There was a bunch of garden seats to allow people to sit down and be in a more comfortable position while they're weeding or planting. There was a bunch of cordless things, like a cordless hedge trimmer that made it easier to do that task of trimming the hedge without having to plug it in and have to like go through like bringing the cord out. And again, not every garden has electricity either. And then the other thing that I really liked that I thought would be useful for my garden is a retractable automatic hose. So you can like press a button and it just like whoop, sucks the hose up, because it can be a pain for even like people that don't have a lot of physical challenges to wind up that hose. So good adaptations. There's a lot out there, and a lot of these adaptations are things that you yourself can probably like make or buy.
That's so awesome. I love that. And if you work with an occupational therapist or close to occupational therapy, they can probably recommend some things too.
To end our podcast, back when Jana and I were both working at the Soldier Recovery Unit, I got to write a bunch. Every month I would write a different, it was called a good news story. And so one month I decided to do my story on our beautiful garden, which if we end up making like a blog or something, we'll put some photos up of the garden because it was just like very lush. And so I interviewed one of the soldiers that was one of the people that was really into gardening. He had really never been into gardening before, but when the pandemic started, like Jana mentioned, it kind of became like his pandemic hobby. And so I asked him what has been the impact of gardening on you. And he said, it's been helping me in my recovery. The garden is so quiet and peaceful, and that's where I go to relax. It relaxes my mind, it relaxes my body. And for that, I think I'm going to be picking up gardening when I go back home. And he did go home like pretty shortly after that. And I know I talked to him, and his plans were to make like a whole big garden. And this guy had like never gardened before, but after gardening pretty much every day for like 6 months straight, he was almost a pro. Like we would ask him for so much garden advice, and he was like, yeah, you're a guy, I didn't know how to do any of this. So I think that's really cool, just to show like the growth that can happen.
Our gardeners are such a fun, like such an awesome impact of our time at the Soldier Recovery Unit, because
Yeah,
they really just came to own it. And like it's so cool when someone says like, I'm gonna do this like on my own, or I'm gonna take this and use this, like, you know, that this is something that benefited at least that one person, you know.
yeah. And a lot of them did end up gardening at home. Like I had lots of soldiers tell me, oh, like I'm growing tomatoes at home now, or like, oh, I have this whole garden plot and I decided to like get back into it or get into it at all, just because I was kind of inspired by the beautiful garden that we had out at Schofield.
Yeah, it was a way to like take something that seems like so big and like, look, like we're doing just a little bit of just an hour a day, like what could happen like in your own space doing it. And like we said before, really helped to have other people out there that were doing it too, so they could ask like, like often that was how conversations would start at the garden, right? And friendships would begin was, I have a papaya and it has this bug, like what do I do? And everyone kind of giving ideas of how to do it. It's a really, gardening can really become that community, like can really grow the community in that way. So yeah, I think sums up our gardening podcast, guys. It was so much fun to do the research for this, and so much fun to kind of go back and talk about gardening and how it's worked for us and how we've seen it work for others, and what the the possible opportunities are for recreation therapists out there, for participants out there, to be able to use this modality to be really helpful. It just got me really excited about all of the really awesome, like, evidence-based stuff that we can see, like, positive impact in our own experiences and in experiences that are documented, so that we can go out and replicate what these studies are doing. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening, and we will see you next time. Reminder, if you're looking for our show notes, we'll have a link to them. And if you have any questions for us, you can email us at realtalkrectherapy@gmail.com. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.